Well, joining us with more insight is Aurel Braun. He's a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
So give us an idea. How would you characterize Russia's economic relations and trade volume with African countries up to this point?
Well, this summit had the trappings of success. There was pomp and ceremony. There were 43 heads of state or government. Mr. Putin seemed to be in his element. It was almost like back in the Soviet days in the Cold War, except Russia is not the Soviet Union, and this is not the Cold War, and Russia is a relatively small player in Africa, except in the sale of weapons. Russia sells about $14 billion worth of weapons to African countries. This is about 1/3 of Russian military exports, and this is where Russia's strength is. But there is, as in the case of many things Russian, a significant disconnect between appearance and reality.
So then, in terms of the timing, why this increased attention to the African continent now?
Mr. Putin seems to have an instinct for taking advantage of gaps, of opportunities when the West pulls back, when there are some disputes, as in the case of Egypt and Ethiopia. You will notice at the summit, they had a meeting hosted by Russians between the Ethiopian and the Egyptian leaders. There are problems in Libya, so he's trying to get back in. But the difficulty is that Russia just does not have the economic weight. It does not have the economic tools. It does not have the economic capabilities. To give an example, Russian trade with all of the continent is about $20 billion a year. They promise that in the next 4 to 5 years, they will double that trade. But at the moment, China's trade alone with the African continent is 10 times that of Russia.
So then, for trade partners, huge trade partners like China and the US who are sort of looking on, what do you think they're making of Russia's advances into the African continent when it comes to trade?
In some cases, there may be a discomfort, not because Russia is likely to displace these countries. As far as trade is concerned, they don't have the multiple capabilities. The bulk of Russian trade is weapons and some grain, but Russia can be a disruptive element. It can cause problems. It can fuel tensions. It can miscalculate. Many of the African countries just want to buy more weapons. Those will be used perhaps against other countries on the continent. And this can create conflict that could draw in the United States, that can make matters more difficult for China. And it is this kind of possible mischief, rather than real power, that, let's say, United States, the EU countries, and China may be more concerned about.
Now, Russia is a BRICS country, and we know that South Africa is the only African country in the BRICS group. Do you think that could give South Africa an edge over, say, other African nations when it comes to the best opportunities for collaboration and partnership with Russia?
Certainly, Russia is paying considerable attention to South Africa, and they even pulled this kind of stunt, the symbolic flying of 2 nuclear bombers to South Africa. They had never flown it before to demonstrate Russian strength, but it really isn't a true indication of strength. There had been a long historical relationship between Russia and Egypt, but the president of Egypt, Mr. Sisi, may be willing to buy some weapons from Russia, but is closely allied with the United States. So I think what Russia can do in terms of certain areas is rather limited, but it is able to cause some disruption, and that's why it bears watching. It is also a case that given Russia's limited resources, this may be a kind of imperial overreach. The ambitions of Russia may be considerably different from its capabilities.
Now, certainly, you appear to be a lot more skeptical about Russia's development in Africa. And we know that a lot of countries around the world, they're also struggling with things like aging populations that are destined to outpace the number of working adults that are going to replace them. We know that most African countries don't have that issue. How can African countries leverage their advantages to really grow their economies in this relationship?
Well, some of the African countries, in fact, are growing rapidly. Ethiopia's economy is growing. Nigeria has an enormous amount of potential in oil wealth, and there is a huge population growth in Africa. So if you contrast, let's say, the projections that the United Nations had in terms of demographic, Ethiopia could reach a population of 700, 800 million, whereas Russia has a population right now of 143 million. It may be falling. So not only is there economic growth potential in Africa that is enormous, but Africa can also export labor. The question is whether countries like Russia or the European countries will find a way of productively exchanging things, including bringing in labor that they need, and not just a matter of goods and services.
All right, thank you so much, Aurel Braun there, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.